If you turn to the final chapter of the Gospel of Mark, chapter 16, you'll read about how the women visited the tomb early Sunday morning and were informed by an angel that Jesus was raised from the dead and that they should go tell this to the disciples. They then depart from the tomb in verse 8, and right before you get to verse 9, there'll be a textual note that indicates verses 9 to 20 are not part of the earliest gospel manuscripts of Mark. The earliest extant manuscripts of the gospel lack verses 9 to 20. Verses 9 to 20 record three different visits that Jesus made to the disciples. And at the final visit, he visits all 11 apostles at once, and he gives them the Great Commission, and then he ascends to heaven and is enthroned. This is one of two complete stories that are in question, in doubt, as to whether they were part of the original four Gospels. The other famous story is the story of the adulteress in John chapter 8. That's the subject of my own PhD studies in narrative criticism. When it comes to Mark chapter 16, there are two views, not surprisingly, always at least two views, among textual critics and biblical scholars more widely. The majority view is that probably the original Gospel of Mark ended at verse 8, and that verses 9 to 20 were crafted sometime in the next 50 years to kind of finish out the Gospel and present appearances of Jesus and the Great Commission and so on in the way you find in some of the other Gospels. The arguments for this are pretty straightforward. The passage is not in the earliest Greek copies of Mark. And also, those who have done the work of looking at the style of Mark, even though it's just 12 verses, they point out some anomalies in the style of verses 9 to 20 that don't seem to be consistent with the style of the author in the rest of the Gospel, up to verse 8 of chapter 16. The minority view is that verses 9 to 20 were in fact a part of the original publication of the Gospel of Mark and for whatever reason dropped out or very early on, also probably within the first 50 years. And they point out that even though the earliest extant Greek copies of Mark lack verses 9 to 20, it's only two manuscripts, Codex Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, which date to around the time of the Nicene Creed in the mid-300s. That's when we have two manuscripts that lack the passage, and it's only two manuscripts. Literally 99% of all extant Greek manuscripts of the Gospel of Mark do contain verses 9 to 20. Now, there's more complexity than this in the manuscript evidence. I'm just trying to make it simple for this video. The other thing that they'll point out for the minority position is that there are church fathers from 200 years earlier, mid to late 2nd century, where they do refer to the passage, verses 9 to 20, quote from the passage, and connect it to the Gospel of Mark. So they clearly had manuscripts of the Gospel of Mark, which are 200 years earlier, and they do, in fact, or probably contained, or must have contained, the ending verses 9 to 20. The other thing they'll say is that though there are a couple of stylistic anomalies in vocabulary and grammar in the final 12 verses, 9 to 20, there are also positive features which are distinctively Markan in the vocabulary and grammar that do correspond to the other parts of the Gospel of Mark. And if you isolate some passages earlier in the Gospel of Mark, they also contain an equal degree of anomalies, and yet nobody questions the validity or the Markan quality of those verses, those stories. So all this to say that the majority view continues to prevail, and for my part, not being a textual critic, I have inclined toward the majority position for the reasons already stated here. I've done some other videos on this channel where I looked more carefully at the stylistic evidence. What I'd like to do here is offer new evidence, very concisely, from narrative criticism. It wasn't my goal to try and resolve the text critical problem at the end of the Gospel of Mark, but over the last couple of years I've been trying to study the Gospel from a purely narrative critical perspective, and so I think there is some new evidence that weighs in on the question, maybe even dispositively. Up until now, I would say the evidence is never just fully dispositive. You could look at all the scholarship, you could read commentaries and their take on it, you can watch 50 YouTube videos and get everybody's analyses. Basically, it's the same evidence, and it's not maybe crystal clear what originally the situation was just based on that evidence. But I'd like to suggest that I think the narrative critical evidence is quite compelling. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at the narrative structure of the Gospel of Mark. And for the most part, I would like to concede that there are lots of different views about how to read the narrative structure, the narrative arrangement of the Gospel of Mark. And you could simply say right now that I'm just going to be adding just yet another way that isn't really substantive. There's not enough evidence, or there's not enough layered evidence to really make it convincing that probably this is what Mark had in mind when he himself structured the gospel. But I'd like to just speak very briefly to the natural doubt we have. First of all, that I understand it. Most of the time I read other people's structures, narrative arrangements of the various books of the Bible, and I'm not overly convinced that it's as clear as sometimes it seems to be the person who's writing it up. But then I would like to point out that it's not in principle a problem of clarity or compelling evidence. If we listen to the song Hey Jude by Paul McCartney and the Beatles, we would say, yeah, there's a pretty clear arrangement to the song because there's an opening refrain, Hey Jude, don't make it bad. And then a little bit later, Hey Jude, don't be afraid, and so on. The opening refrain becomes a refrain throughout the whole song, and it divides it up into natural parts along with 4 stanzas each and so on. You can use a closing refrain. In the Journey's love ballad song, Faithfully, each part signs off, I'm forever yours faithfully. And it's pretty clear when you look at these songs or listen to them that they have a very clear narrative arrangement. And we can safely say, even if we never heard Paul McCartney or Steve Perry comment on it, that this is probably the authorial structure to these songs. So all that just to say, in principle, there's not a problem here with finding a compelling structure that goes right back to the author. It's just a question of whether the evidence is clear enough. So if we start with Mark chapter 1 and verse 1, we get introduced right away to an opening refrain. Mark, in other words, is going to use this technique. It's used in classical writers, it's used in biblical writers, where there's a refrain that is used to demarcate the major parts of the book. And it's really not that difficult, I think, to see what the refrain is because it's right in the opening verses. The verse 1 says, the beginning of the gospel announcement of Jesus the Messiah, Jesus the Savior King. The word gospel, evangelion, means the grand announcement, the big announcement, or the glad tidings, or the good news. So we'll just translate it as gospel announcement to remind us that the word implies an announcement. So the beginning of the gospel announcement of this Savior King. Well, why is it good news? Because the restoration of the world has been inaugurated in the coming of Jesus the King. But then it turns to this refrain. It starts by quoting Malachi, where God himself is speaking, and he says, behold, I send my announcer. So if there's going to be a big announcement, a gospel announcement, there needs to be an announcer. And so God himself initiates the announcement. He's in control of the announcement and kicks it off by sending John the Baptizer. And it says in verse 4, John the Baptizer came not just baptizing, but making proclamation, kyrisin, being a herald, making an announcement. And what does that mean, making proclamation? Making proclamation of the gospel announcement. So God himself initiates it, and the announcer comes sent by God to make proclamation of the gospel announcement. So that's the opening of the book, and that creates the refrain in the Gospel of Mark. From that point on, God himself or his Son, the Messiah, the Son of God, will initiate each stage of the gospel announcement. At the end of chapter 1, Jesus has amassed a large crowd of people in the city of Capernaum, and he takes off in the morning to leave the city, and the disciples go out to try and detain him and bring him back to Capernaum, where the crowds are. And he says to them, he's not going to go back into the village. He says, let us go, so that I might make proclamation in neighboring towns. And he went about making proclamation of the gospel announcement. So in the end of chapter 1, you begin stage 2 of the grand announcement. The King himself, the Messiah, initiates it. Let us go. And they go forth to make proclamation in a new area. Then in chapter 3, once again, the King, the Messiah, he's got a large crowd. In fact, this one is much larger. They're coming from all over Israel, and they're so large that Jesus cannot really handle healing people because he's being crushed by people there along the shore of the Sea of Galilee. And so we're told he goes up on a mountain, and in order to add workers to represent him, he appoints 12 men as apostles. And notice their name, they're called apostles because that means sent ones. And it says in the text, he chose these 12 men, named them apostles, in order to send them to make proclamation. And of course, it's implied, make proclamation of the gospel announcement. And that's beginning of stage 3. Then you get to chapter 6. And once again, Jesus takes the 12, only this time he actually, for the first time in the book, sends them. He began for the first time to send the apostles, the 12. And they went forth and made proclamation. This is just the wording right in the text. It indicates the refrain has kicked off again, and we're beginning stage 4. Only now we're starting the second half of the book. And I say it's the second half because there's going to be 3 more stages. And in this opening refrain, there's a slight modification. He's going to send the 12 apostles by twos. He's going to send them as pairs by 2. So he sends 2 apostles to one village, 2 apostles to another village, and so on. And that's a slight change from the first half of the book. And then in chapters 10 and the beginning of 11, as the king approaches Jerusalem, he once again sends 2 of the disciples, sends them as a pair, and they go into the nearby village. He says to them, go into the village. Notice it's the king again initiating this stage of the gospel announcement. Go, he says. He commands them to go. And they go in and they fetch the donkey and they bring him back. And the king sits on the donkey like King Solomon did in the first Kings. And he goes forth and is acclaimed as the king there in Jerusalem as he enters famously into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday. And then the final stage of the book, again, chapter 14, it says that the king sends 2 disciples, sends them as a pair. And again, that's the refrain changing slightly in the second half of the book. And he sends them into the city of Jerusalem. It's because the Passover is near. And he says, go into the city. And his command is obeyed. And the 2 disciples go. And he initiates the final stage of the proclamation of the king, the coming of the king of the Jews, as will be publicly declared when he's on the cross. So all of this creates 6 major sections to the Gospel of Mark. And it all is on theme with the stated purpose or theme of the book right in chapter 1, verse 1, the beginning of the gospel announcement of Jesus, the Savior, King, the Messiah. In one sense, what's crucial here is that the announcement doesn't occur all at once. It's not a one-off event. An announcement could be a one-off event, but not here. It's more like a modern wedding announcement where it occurs in stages. You first tell your family and friends privately you've got engaged and there's going to be a wedding. And then subsequent to that, you send out a social media announcement. And then subsequent to that, later you send out a save the date and so on. The announcement comes in stages. So that's what's happening according to the Gospel of Mark. But in addition to this, we have some additional evidence to help us feel extra confident that we have read Mark's structure properly, that this is in fact Mark's structure to the book. And that is, he not only uses an opening refrain, he also uses a closing refrain. So let's look at the closing episode, that is the episode that precedes each of these opening refrains. So the first one is at the end of chapter 1, where Jesus, for the first time in the book, enters a synagogue. And he is opposed by an enemy, a spiritual enemy, a demoniac, and he silences him. Be silent, he says. And of course, this is on theme. If the king is in control of the gospel announcement, then we're not surprised as a culminating event to each stage in the first half of the book that the king silences all other voices. So only his announcement is heard, and he is in control of the information of that announcement. And then, of course, he immediately goes into the house of Simon Peter, and his mother-in-law is lying with a fever in bed, and she's limp, her body is weak, and she's unable to even lift her hands, and she cannot serve the people, the many guests that are in her house. And so Jesus takes her by the hand, and he restores her hands. and he raises her up, it says. And what does she do? She begins to serve all of the guests. So again, this is on theme. If this is the gospel announcement of the restoration of the world, well, we all know that when Adam and Eve sinned in the garden, their work in life was frustrated. When Adam was going to till the ground, he would do it in a frustrated way. His work would be hindered. And now we find someone who cannot work with her hands, and Jesus restores her hands so she's unleashed or restored, and she can now work properly within her house and serve the guests. So again, the closing episode with these three distinctive features is in keeping with the major theme stated explicitly in chapter 1, verse 1 of the book. This repeats. When we get to the end of stage 2, Jesus enters a synagogue for the second time. And for the second time, he silences his opponents. It literally says they became silent. And for the third time in the book, only the third time, he is going to restore someone's hand, because there's a man there in the synagogue who is infirmed. He's not blind, he's not deaf, he's not crippled. It says that his hand is all mangled and withered up and damaged in some way, that he cannot work. Of course, that's the implication. It's the Sabbath. For this man, every day is the Sabbath. And Jesus restores his hand, just like he did with Simon Peter's mother-in-law. He can now work, which is, again, a token of the restoration of the world. Man put back to work. And then in the final episode of stage 3, once again, Jesus, well, he doesn't enter into a synagogue for the third time only. Instead, he enters into the very house of a synagogue ruler, because his daughter has died. And he goes into the house, and once again, he silences his opponents by driving all the people out who mock him and have been wailing loudly. And once again, for the third time only in the book, he takes the girl by her hand. It's not just that she can't work with her hands. Her whole body is limp. She's completely dead. But he takes her by the hand, and he raises her up, and he restores her whole life, not just her work. This is the first resurrection from the dead in the book, and it's the natural climax to the end of the first half of the book. Then, when you turn into the second half of the book, you get a different closing refrain. At the end of chapter 9, stage 4, we read that the king takes his seat. Again, the question way back when Solomon took the throne of David was who was going to sit in the throne. And when Solomon was announced as king, the way it was announced was Solomon is sitting in the throne of David. So taking the seat of the throne is an indicator of what a king does when he manages the affairs of his kingdom. And this king takes his seat, and he calls the 12 apostles in chapter 9, and he begins for the first time to give them instructions for the Great Commission. This is the Great Commission Part 1. There are 3 in the book, actually. And the reason this is the Great Commission Part 1 is because Jesus has announced for the very first time, right before this, that he is going to be departing from the world in death and after his resurrection, and he will have to come back in glory at some undefined later time. It doesn't tell us how long it'll be. But he begins to prepare the disciples for their mission in his absence. And so he uses a phrase that he hasn't yet used in the gospel, which is, "In my name you will speak, and in my name you will act." So multiple times in this passage he uses the phrase, "in my name," because it implies he's not present. He's going to be gone. And they will be carrying out their mission, their gospel mission, in his absence, and therefore speaking and acting on his behalf in his name, and onomati mu in Greek. First time the phrase is used in the book. That will repeat in chapter 13 at the end of stage 5. The king will take his seat on the Mount of Olives, and he'll call some apostles near him, and he will begin to give them instructions about their gospel mission. When he's gone, in his absence, life on earth, the ministry of the apostles, the gospel mission that will go out to the world is part of the main discussion in chapter 13. And once again, for only the second time of the book, he uses this phrase, "in my name," and onomatimu. And then again, when we get to but now we have a problem. We're now getting to chapter 16. The final episode of the book. But what do we do with it? If the book ends at verse 8, when the women are at the tomb and then leave from the tomb, we would have to say that the refrain is broken. There is no repetition of the refrain in that story. But what if we add verses 9 to 20? What happens then? Well, Jesus appears to the 12 apostles, or the 11 apostles at that stage. And in the final verses of the book, he begins to give them instructions now for the third time for the Great Commission. And for the third time, he talks about how they will speak and act, quote, in my name, end quote. That phrase is not used anywhere else, just like the king doesn't sit among the apostles and give instructions for the Great Commission anywhere else except in these 3 closing episodes. And then, of course, famously in the final verses of the book, the king takes his seat, not now on earth among the apostles, but climactically in heaven itself. He's ascended to heaven and he sits at the right hand of God. So that seems to be a part of the closing refrain pattern that's in the other closing episodes and the second half of the book. And of course, that part of the book ends with a resurrection. It's only the second resurrection in the book, only now not the resurrection of a human being like the daughter of Jairus, the synagogue ruler, but the resurrection of the king himself who's been put to death. He's raised triumphantly, and he's installed as the king. Now, we have another element to the narrative. So let's look just at chapters 14 to 16. What are the stories in these 3 chapters? Is there an arrangement to them? And does that in any way indicate anything about the final story, verses 9 to 20? So what we're told in chapter 14, verse 1, is that the Passover is just a couple of days away, and the chief priests and Pharisees and scribes and so on have organized themselves to accomplish 2 goals at the Passover. They want to, number 1, arrest Jesus, and number 2, have him killed. 2 goals: arrest and kill Jesus. What we find then is that these 2 goals will be played out over 9 stories. And the 9 stories are very easy to ascertain because each of them begins with a statement about a new setting, usually a new location. Sometimes included is a new chronology. So each of the stories begins this way. The first one begins that it's a couple days before the Passover, and Jesus is in the village of Bethany. And we're told about a story centering around Bethany. We're then told that he goes into the city of Jerusalem with the apostles, and he goes to a new location, and certain events happen there, like the Passover supper, the Last Supper. And then the third story, he leaves the city of Jerusalem, and he goes to the Mount of Olives, to the Garden of Gethsemane. And in the Garden of Gethsemane, he is arrested. And that's the end of the third story. But you can also see that the end of that trio of stories has accomplished the first goal that the Jewish authorities had, which was to arrest the king. There follows another trio of stories, 3 more stories. The first one begins with them changing location. They go to the house of the high priest, and there Jesus has a trial at which he's convicted. That's story number 1. They then transfer him to a new location, story number 2. They bring him to Pontius Pilate, and here there is a second trial before Pontius Pilate, and there again he is convicted and sentenced to death, and that brings him to the third story. He's transferred to a third location, and that is Golgotha, the place of the skull. And at the place of the skull, Jesus is killed. That accomplishes goal number 2. So the second trio of stories culminates in goal number 2 being achieved. These are the enemies of Jesus accomplishing their goals. Although if you look at the details of the stories, you'll see that the King, Jesus, is facilitating the accomplishing of these goals. But then we have a final trio of stories. After he is killed, what happens? On Friday evening, again, note the chronological marker, Friday evening, right before the Sabbath, Jesus is taken and put into a new location. He's buried in a tomb. There then passes a couple of days. And story number 2 is that on early Sunday morning, while the sun is rising, the women come to the tomb. So it's not a new location. It's a couple of days later at sunrise, they come to the tomb. And there's a second story. They're told that he's been raised up from the dead. And then verses 9 to 20 are going to serve as the third story, or at least they do function as a third story, the story of the appearances, a new setting, not early in the morning at sunset, but in the morning still, after Jesus has been raised. So he's already been raised, and it's in the morning, but it's not at sunset. It's later in the morning. He appears to Mary, then he appears to 2 disciples outside of Jerusalem, and then he appears to the 11 apostles. And then he ascends into heaven. So that final trio of stories is what you might call the divine answer, heaven's answer, or the God the Father's response to the opening 2 movements, where Jesus is first arrested in the culminating scene and then killed in the second culminating scene. In this third culminating scene, Jesus is not only raised up to life, but he's raised up to heaven itself, and he's seated at the right hand of God. But let's look at the culminating scene in Gethsemane, the first one, and then compare it to what happens in the culminating scene in the controversial verses 9 to 20. In the Garden of Gethsemane, what happens is it begins with Jesus announcing to the apostles, this is right as they're entering the garden, on their way up to the garden, he announces that they are going to be scattered when the shepherd is struck down. And Peter, of course, objects, we all know famously, but nonetheless, Jesus asserts that he will be denied and by Peter, and he and all the disciples will abandon him, and they will scatter around Jerusalem. So notice the emphasis of the story, that as you enter into this story centered on the Mount of Olives in Gethsemane, the focus is on the disciples abandoning Jesus, what we're going to call the great dereliction. As they go into the garden, of course, Jesus separates from the disciples 3 times in order to pray, and on all 3 occasions he falls to the earth, it says. He falls to the earth and he prays to his Father. And when he prays to the Father, he prays that this cup be removed, if it's possible. That is, that this hour, that he not face the hour of death, the cup where his blood is poured out, which he just talked about at the Last Supper. So he's praying that it be removed. But he adds immediately, nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. So the removal of the cup is the removal of the cup of death, but Jesus insists on drinking it. He will follow the will of the Father and die. And then, of course, the soldiers come, the servants of the high priest, with Judas, and Judas betrays Jesus. Another problem here, the apostle not denying Jesus like Peter's going to do, but betraying him. Again, this is the great dereliction of the apostles, this scene in Gethsemane. And Jesus is kissed and then arrested, but as he gets arrested, one of the disciples puts his hand to the hilt of his sword, and he draws out the sword, and he swings it violently to try and kill one of the arresting soldiers. And as you can imagine, this is the exact opposite of what his responsibilities as an apostle are supposed to be. He's already gone around and been a representative of Jesus, sent out into various cities, proclaiming the gospel announcement and healing people and so on. So this is an absolute dereliction by Peter. In this case, he's not named, but it's one of the disciples derelicting, if you will, his abandonment of his basic responsibilities as an apostle. And then it says, all the apostles abandon Jesus and scatter. So again, this scene in Gethsemane, the emphasis on the story is what I'm going to call the great dereliction, an emphasis on the complete implosion of apostolic responsibility. Remember, when Jesus comes to the disciples on those 3 occasions, he prays 3 times, and each time he comes back to the disciples, and he presents himself to the disciples, but they're asleep. and he rebukes them for sleeping. They should be awake because things are coming to a head. The events are too serious, and they need to wake up. And so the 3 times he comes to them focus on their dereliction. All right, all that to say, I'm calling it the Great Dereliction. That's the emphasis in the story, and there's a number of features reinforcing that major theme. Now, verses 9 to 20. What happens is Jesus comes to the disciples 3 times. First to Mary Magdalene, then to 2 of the disciples, then to the 11 apostles. And you'll notice that sort of what happens in the Garden of Gethsemane gets repeated. He's going to come 3 times to the disciples. And don't you know, these are the only 2 stories in the whole of the Gospel of Mark where Jesus comes like this 3 times and successively appears to the disciples. And on all 3 occasions, or rather the 3 successive comings, are enumerated in Gethsemane. It says when it's the 3rd time that he comes to them. And in verses 9 to 20, it enumerates it the first time and then the last time. It gets enumerated just in these 2 stories, the only stories like this in the whole of the Gospel of Mark. And what is the focus when Jesus comes to the apostles and the disciples in verses 9 to 20? It's about how he's going to restore their faith. And they end up believing, of course, when he appears finally to all 11 apostles. And then he gives them what people call the Great, not dereliction, the Great Commission. And it's about how he restores the apostles to their mission. And what are the features that get focused on? Well, he tells them that they're going to go forth and preach the gospel to every creature and go forth throughout the whole world. And that is, in fact, what they do. They go forth everywhere. Pandahu, the final verse of the book. They aren't scattered, abandoning Jesus, but they go forth strategically and confidently to make proclamation in the name of the King. And they are doing this again in a sort of triumph, in a sort of victory, given what happened in Gethsemane. And Jesus has been raised up, and he's filling them with the strength of faith and confidence, and they go forth all around the world to make proclamation of the gospel announcement. And you can see how this is restoration from what happened in the Garden of Gethsemane. It's a very strategic description of what happens to the apostles at this stage, the final story, story 9, the culminating event in the final trio, just like the culminating event in the first trio. What else does he tell them? He tells them they're going to drink a mortal drink. They're going to have to drink something that could kill them. And if they are forced to drink something that could kill them, Jesus said, for the sake of the triumph and victory of the gospel, he will spare their lives supernaturally, or at least some of them, of the believers, will be restored, or rather will not die. And again, this is only for the believers, those who are trusting Jesus, not those who are derelict. And Jesus is working alongside them, it says in verse 20, and he will keep them alive. But now notice the contrast. In the garden, Jesus said he was prepared to drink the cup, and that cup would kill him, and it did kill him. He died. But now he's promising the apostles who are believers that in trusting him, he will spare some of them their lives, and they will not die for the sake of the triumph of the gospel. And then also he tells them that they will take their hands and lay them on the wounded and the infirmed and the sick. And they will, in laying their hands on people, heal them. But what happened in the Garden of Gethsemane was that disciple drew his sword with his hand and he wounded somebody. You see how in the Great Commission we have the restoration, the triumph, the victory for the apostles themselves, in addition to Jesus, for the kingdom's sake. They are restored, and they will go forth and carry on his mission of making proclamation of the restoration of the world that has come, that has been inaugurated in the coming of the King. And then, of course, Jesus doesn't fall to the earth like he does when he prays in agony. He doesn't fall upon the earth, epitisis, in the Garden of Gethsemane, but he's raised up into the heavens iston uranon, I think is what it is in Greek, taken up into the very heavens and seated at the right hand of God. So this is like a crossword, if you've ever done a crossword, where you have the across words and then you have the down words. And you have completely different clues for the words that go across from the words that go down. So that if you put a word across and you think the answer is oval, then whatever the clues are for the down words, the letters out of the word oval have to be picked up and used in those 4 down words. There has to be an O, a V, an A, and an L as part of those down words. In other words, there's what you would call an intersectional agreement. That's sort of what we're seeing in the gospel structures in Mark, that depending on your line of approach to the narrative, we're finding that verses 9 to 20 have an intersectional agreement. We need all of these features, which are in just these verses 9 to 12, in order to see the pattern hold, whether we're talking about the closing refrain or whether we're talking about the culminating story in each of the 3 movements in the final section. What do we do with this? Well, it seems on the surface to be compelling evidence, narrative critical evidence, that the original author who designed the narrative of the book clearly had a role for verses 9 to 20 of chapter 16 going in multiple directions, and that's what explains the various features that are in that story. Can we say for certain that someone couldn't have come along later and added verses 9 to 20 and created this intersectional agreement? Well, it seems unlikely, because the closing refrain was created not in the final verses, 9 to 20. The pattern of the closing refrain, the distinctive features of the king taking his seat and instructing the apostles about their great commission and doing so in this language of in my name, that pattern was created in chapters 9 and chapters 13. And that came out of the opening refrain pattern. That's how we even got to those closing episodes and saw the closing refrain. So that pattern was created by the author, clearly. Could someone have just said, oh, hey, the author, I guess, forgot or something, a final closing scene, and then they added that? Well, if that's the case, the author also forgot his 9th story that went along with the other 8 stories of chapters 14 to 16, because that was arranged as a set of a trio of stories 3 times, 3 movements, a trio of stories, where the culminating event ends up being echoed. First, the disaster, the dereliction of the apostles in Gethsemane, and then the Great Commission, the triumph and the victory of the gospel announcement as it goes forth into the whole world. So that would mean like the apostle, the Mark, forgot the 2 roles that verses 9 to 20 were supposed to play in 2 totally different narrative arrangements. So that seems very unlikely. I don't think that's compelling at all. I can't imagine anyone drawing that conclusion. What's more probable is that there was a final story after verse 8, and it had these very features that allow that story, verses 9 to 20, the story of the appearances in the Great Commission, to function in these 2 different directions and create the intersectional agreement that maybe that story was lost and someone from memory composed the final verses 9 to 20. Of course, if that's what happened, their memory must have been really, really good. So in other words, we basically have the story anyway. But then when you add in that there are, in fact, some vocabulary and some grammar features that are actually corresponding to the stylistic qualities that are distinctive of Mark the evangelist, that means at least some of the wording seems to have come from that lost story, if that's the case. So it seems to me we have 2 reasonable conclusions we can choose from. One is that, and this is purely from a narrative critical perspective, one solution is that the original story was lost, but that whoever crafted verses 9 to 20 has incorporated from memory precise stylistic features from the original story, as well as 10 or so distinctive features that are the main emphasis of verses 9 to 20, so that it can serve the dual role it has to serve in the different structural arrangements. So that's one option. In other words, we basically have the story anyway, even if it's been recrafted. And the other option is that verses 9 to 20 were simply original to the gospel, and Mark wrote them. But that, for whatever reason, they dropped out in a very early few copies of the Gospel of Mark, but otherwise simply were a part of the long-standing tradition of the Gospel of Mark. For my part, as just from a narrative critical perspective and just a kind of historical perspective, I would choose door number 2. It seems a lot simpler to just conclude that these verses were crafted by the original author to serve the various narrative functions that it does, and that's why we have this intersectional agreement in the narrative structures. The other answer seems just a little too elaborate and complex to me, and it'd be easier just to say that for whatever reason the final story dropped out of a few manuscripts that affected some other manuscripts, and that's why we've got a couple that lack it. But what do you think? I'd be very interested to hear your responses to the evidence, what you think is convincing, what isn't convincing, and do you know of anyone else that gives any sort of evidence like this? As far as I know, it's new evidence. I've not seen it anywhere in the scholarship or in commentaries, and yet it seems to me that it's fairly clear narrative evidence. Again, this is narrative critical evidence. In the final case, one has to turn to the textual critics. They're the experts who make the text critical judgments in the end. I'm simply saying, from a purely narrative critical evidence, it seems to me pretty compelling that verses 9 to 20 were part of the original design of the Gospel of Mark.